Dear Joshua Hall, you have an academic background in Central and Southwest Asian studies, English literature, the Persian poetic tradition, Islamic philosophy, and the scholarly study of the Baha'i Faith. After completing an MPhil in Islamic Studies and History at the University of Oxford, you are now pursuing a doctorate at UCLA. You also work as a translator from Arabic and Persian into English. Your provisional translations of the Baha'i writings are available both on your personal website and on the Baha'iLibrary.com platform. In 2002, you published a notable article, Bahá'u'lláh and the God of Avicenna, in the Journal of Bahá'í Studies, marking a significant scholarly achievement. Additionally, you are someone who may have further insights to contribute to the September interview with Stephen Phelps and Nate Grant titled, What Kind of Language is Revelation? But generally, we kind of agreed that we will maybe discuss about the philosophy and the metaphysics of the Baha'i faith, but also whatever else you wanted to bring in as part of the discussion. So with that said, I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Philip. One of the questions that's really been animating my academic work is what are the rational foundations of the Baha'i faith? And what is its rational or logical structure? And it seems to me that one of the distinguishing features and attributes of the Baha'i faith is that it is a quintessentially philosophical religion. Not to say that the other religions don't have robust metaphysical frameworks and philosophies. Of course they do, and the Baha'i faith draws from them, and Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha and the Ba affirm many of the ideas from previous traditions. What I mean is this, that if you look directly at the scriptures of those faiths, they don't present philosophical arguments as such, or the philosophical content is there in potential. And it was elaborated over the centuries and developed in the systems that we saw subsequently. But because of the time in which the Baha'i faith appeared, and because of the increased capacity of humanity at the time, all our writings are suffused with incredibly elaborate and sophisticated metaphysical and philosophical apparatus, which is waiting there to be discovered and to be seen. Not to say that there are not many secondary and ancillary points to be developed, and not to say that there is not a diversity of opinion to be had among Baha'is. It is simply to say that we are heirs to an incredibly rich intellectual tradition. And I think that it is for us to present this intellectual tradition in the world and to show precisely what it is that Baha'is believe and what basis it has.
That's a great point. That's a great point to open with. Thank you. Okay, so I'm thinking now about some Baha'i scholars who have tried to argue that there is a comprehensive philosophy in the Baha'i writings. And when I think of such statements, I also think of the way different scholars have tried to map what that philosophy might look like. And within that discussion, I haven't heard a lot about Avicenna, but you have worked on that. So what are your thoughts about that? Where do you see Avicenna's philosophy in all this?
I think that Avicenna is an incredibly important figure world historically. And he's also important in the general tradition of Islamic philosophy, especially in the Persian world. And he has direct relevance to the Baha'i faith insofar as many of the arguments that he presents, say for the immortality of the soul or for the existence of God, are explicitly affirmed by Baha'u'lláh and especially Abdu'l-Baha. And that the philosophy he advanced has principles which are Baha'i principles, Baha'i philosophical principles. These ideas are not necessarily or always unique to Avicenna because he received the tradition of Greek philosophy, based on the writings of Aristotle and Plato. And he received what his Muslim predecessors and Christian and Jewish, in fact, were able to accomplish in those spheres. Well, the Jewish philosophers, the most prominent came after Avicenna in this domain. In fact, Maimonides. But I think that by studying Avicenna, I think that we can get more clarity about what the Baha'i positions actually are. Although, and also at what points the Baha'i teachings really transcend what was done in Islamic philosophy before the Baha'i faith.
Cool. Do you want to go a little bit more into Avicenna's philosophy? So you've pretty much wrote a whole paper on just how different concepts from Avicenna can be found in the language of the Baha'i writings. So the philosophical notions that are present in Avicenna are mirrored in the Baha'i writings. And I think that was quite a compelling argument. And you are mostly speaking about the first cause, or the necessary existent, and relating that to the use of language in the Baha'i writings. And I think that was quite powerful, and I think it is very useful precisely because this sort of descriptions and comparisons are not being made in a huge number at the moment. So maybe you want to go a little bit into that. So that brings in Aristotle's the four causes of Aristotle. It's kind of like the background for a lot of that argument, and then you talk about the necessary existent. Do you want to go a bit more into it?
I'd love to go into this.
Okay, cool.
So I think the first question that we're faced with when we look at the nature of reality is whether our cognitive faculties, our rationality, is adequate to understand anything about the world in which we find ourselves, or anything about ourselves. And I think that the best starting point is simply to say, yes, it is. That we have first principles, which are first supplied by logic, such as the principle of non-contradiction and the structure of a valid argument. And we have fundamental concepts and intuitions about being and existence and its nature. So, for example, we can immediately think about existence as such and about dependent or independent existence, of cause and effect, of an entity and its attributes. And using these concepts and using the principle of non-contradiction, we can formulate arguments about the general structure of reality. And that we must do this, and that this is metaphysics. And metaphysics is characterized, therefore, by a rational inquiry into the nature of existence as such and the general features of reality. It is not an empirical science or discipline, because any of the empirical sciences do not look at reality as such or its general structures, or what any being whatsoever, what attributes any one being whatsoever must have insofar as it is a being. Rather, any of the empirical sciences look at one section of reality with a particular method to the exclusion of other. So, for example, the biologist looks at the phenomena of life. His or her methodologies are not the same as the physicist or the chemist or the psychologist. They're distinct. And he doesn't think about reality as a whole. He thinks about one section of it. And he advances theories and hypotheses, which are inductively the best explanations for the data which he finds. The physicist looks at things within time and space, and he constructs abstract mathematical models to describe how objects within time and space, and to perform predictions. But he doesn't look at beings as such, right? He doesn't look at the universal features of being. He looks at what can be known inductively about things in time and space, things in motion, and he constructs mathematical theories which abstract certain features of beings, the ways in which they're quantifiable, in order to construct a physical theory. So what we need is metaphysics and philosophy as a discipline that can step back from any one of these empirical sciences and deal with the first principles of things. And it's only such a discipline, I think, which can construct a proper argument for the existence of God. Since an argument within physics or biology or chemistry or psychology or the like for the existence of God would not give us a true deity. It would just give us a physical cause, an explanation within physics which could be proven or disproven, or which could only have so much evidence in favor or against. And the same would hold true for biology if we want to point to a designer or something like this. This is a mistake. We have to look at the world and say it exists, but it need not have existed. It's contingent. And if there's to be an explanation for the existence of the world, it has to utterly transcend the contingent universe in which we find ourselves. And it has to be a being radically unlike any of the finite beings of our experience. And a line of inquiry of this kind leads us to an ultimate reality, which is not a finite or contingent being as such, but which is the absolute precondition for the existence of any finite being, whatever. Something which cannot not exist, because any of the beings in our experience could have failed to exist if this cup were not here, composed of the elements which comprise it, if it were not sustained in existence by virtue of certain atmospheric conditions and a stable temperature, it would immediately cease to exist. So it could have failed to exist. The fact that it exists has a cause and explanation, and it has there are concurrent conditions that explain why it is sustained in existence. Now, if the line of causes simply goes into infinity at any moment whatsoever, the entire cause, a causal chain, would not have any explanation, because the whole causal chain is simply composed of contingent entities, no one of which is able to give existence to the whole. So we have to say, where does existence as such come from? You can imagine if you had an infinite sequence of mirrors, right? And any one mirror simply gets light from the mirror that precedes it. But a chain of mirrors no matter how long it goes, is not able to explain where the light comes from. There has to be something over and above the sequence of mirrors which can give it illumination in order for the mirrors to receive any light whatever, in order to reflect the image of that light to any subsequent member in the series. The same goes for existence. Contingent beings on contingent beings cannot give us an explanation for existence. We have to get to something which is not contingent, which is not finite, something whose very essence is to be. That is the very act of existence. So that in broad outline is a metaphysical argument for the existence of God, at least for an ultimate reality. There are two steps. We could say, well, there has to be an ultimate reality, something that transcends the world, on which all contingent and finite beings ceaselessly depend. And then we have to construct an argument for why we should recognize this absolute reality as properly divine, as having or being possessed of divine attributes. But the thing that I would immediately state here is that belief in this ultimate reality is not simply a matter of faith, or not even principally a matter of faith. If we think of faith as some arbitrary act of the will to believe, or if we think that this God is somehow an entity in the world which could have evidence in his favor or against. He is not the Sasquatch, or he's not a unicorn. He's not a finite being in the world. He is the one explanation possible for the existence of a contingent world, whatever, or for the existence of finite beings, whatever. And to me, we are rationally compelled to come to this conclusion. Now, we could be extremely pessimistic about the reach of our rational faculties. We could say that the notion of a first cause cannot hold because our notion of causality is tied to things in the world, and these are physical causes, not metaphysical causes. And I think that this, and we could have what is generally considered kind of a Kantian picture about this, that causality and other concepts that we have do not map into the world, but really just mark the structure or architectures of our own mind. And to me, such a worldview would collapse into an idealism. Not realism. So what I've just advanced is realism, that in fact we can have a knowledge of reality and its inner structure through metaphysics, and through that we can conclude through a causal principle, that there has to be a first and ultimate cause, something which causes everything else ultimately, but which itself has no cause, by virtue of its very nature as necessary and subsistent existence. The idealist would say, no, all we know is the structure of the mind, and all that we perceive is filtered through the architecture of our intellect. And so really it just tells us about that inner architect and that inner architecture. But I think that such a move would lead ultimately to the theism that the Baha'i would want to advance, and this is why. And we know this historically, because so soon as Kant advanced his transcendental idealism, which said that all that we know about the empirical world is how phenomena are structured by the a priori intuitions of space and time and the categories of the understanding. So soon as he advanced this position of transcendental idealism, you have the idealists like Fichte and Schiller and Schilling, who thought that very well, let us just do away with the phenomena. All there is the mind, and the mind structures reality. But it can't be the empirical limited ego that we observe in ourselves. It has to be a transcendental ego, which somehow posits all of nature in order to reveal or realize itself. So in a sense that we just got to God from another path. What both of these arguments, or both of these paths, either of realism or idealism leads us to, is a reality that transcends nature as we know it, and which is immaterial, because it is precisely the material world which needs to be explained, the world of energy, of time and space. And therefore, this ultimate reality has to be intellective or intelligible, or in the order of mentality. So I think that the fundamental idea of Baha'i philosophy would be that the ultimate reality is intellectual, intellective or spiritual. And the material world is a reflection of and participation in what is fundamental, which is the intellectual world. And the material world in its intelligible structure, that is, in the way that it can be known to the mind and discloses itself to the mind, the physical world, by virtue of that intelligible structure, points to its origin in a universal intellect that pervades all things with its ordering and governing power.
That was brilliant again. Thank you. How does then the divinity that you conceptualize through this kind of arguments, how does that divinity look to us?
In the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'lláh affirms that God cannot properly be known because he is an all-encompassing reality. And I think the idea of the levels of reality is very important to this picture, and any Baha'i is familiar with them. The idea is that not all levels of existence are equal, and that there is an objective hierarchy in the world in terms of the levels of being in existence, which might sound like a controversial thesis, but it is, Baha'u'lláh insists that the idea that everything has the same value is vacuous and would lead to the conclusion that nothing has any particular value whatsoever. So the highest, so that's why he divides reality into, first there is the lowest level, which is pure matter, and then there are the different beings that are purely material, such as rocks and atoms and chemical compounds. Then you have the vegetable reality. You have plants, which have the powers of nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Then you have animals, which have consciousness and sense perception and certain internal faculties of the mind, such as memory and visualization. And then you have the human reality, which participates in and encompasses the lower levels of material reality, but which also transcends them by virtue of the possession of a rational faculty, our capacity for abstract thought, by which we can understand the universe in which we find ourselves and those laws that govern the operations of all beings within it. And then the idea is that beyond the human being with its rational faculty is a realm of spiritual existence, which at the top of it and transcending the whole picture is the deity, is the divinity himself, who is immaterial and outside time and space, is subsistent being itself, is the source of all power, of all goodness that we find in the world, and which is the unceasing condition for the existence of the world. And then between this absolute reality, which is immaterial, eternal, immutable, a perfect unity, and the world of contingent, changing, mutable beings, and this world of multiplicity, there has to be some mediating factor or figure. Just like the sun is able to affect the earth and illuminate everything upon it, but is not directly present on the earth. It's through the mediation of its rays that is able to affect the earth. Or even as the contents of a human mind are communicated through, first, the words that they utter, and the words are the externalization of an interior thought. So the idea is that when God creates the contingent world, he does it through an externalized emanation or word. And in many traditions, this has been called by various names. So in the Old Testament, this is the Sophia. This is the wisdom by which God governs the world and which existed before the foundations of the world. In the Gospel of John, this is the word or the logos. And logos is an interesting word in the original Greek because logos means logic. It means reason. It means the account of a thing. If you give the logos of the thing, you have given its account or its description. It's also word because word is the externalization of an intelligible or intellective content of the mind. And it says in the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was divine. And God creates through the Word, and it is the Word that was associated with the human person of Christ, which enabled him to manifest the perfections of the deity. It is also called the Spirit in the Quran, or the Amr, the command of God, by which he says to a thing, be, and it is. It's also called in Sufis, they also call it the Mohammedan light, and the Nur-i Muhammadi. Sometimes it's called the Holy Spirit. And the Islamic philosophers following the Neoplatonists call it the first intellect, Aql Avban, and that's the term that we find in Avicenna. Plotinus calls it the Nous. He's considered to be the founder of the Neoplatonist philosophy, which is really Plato but taking into account the ideas of Aristotle as well. And in the Baha'i faith, the term preferred by the Bab is Mashiach-e-Valieh, the primal will. But we also find the Holy Spirit and the most exalted word and other terms. So this is the immediate emanation of God, which emanates from him from eternity. God is always a creator. He is always emanating and giving existence to this primal will. And the natural world is, as Baha'u'lláh explains in the Tablet of Wisdom, in some sense the manifestation of the primal will. Because the primal will is this universal intellect. And it pervades all nature as that which provides the universal laws that govern all things. So you can think that the realities or essences of all things are pre-contained in the primal will as its ideas, just like all the contents of a book are pre-contained in the mind of the author. And then they're manifested actually in the writing of this book. So the natures of all things and the necessary relationships that bind all things are pre-contained in the primal will as an archetypal blueprint contains anything else that precedes, or as the conception of the artist precedes the actual concrete realization of his or her art. For example, Mozart conceives a concerto, he conceives it all at once, or a symphony, and then he dictates it, and then it's actually played. But his idea is the blueprint for what we actually see concretely realized. So I think in the hierarchy of reality, we have, say, the absolute deity, Alam Haq, the realm of God, the absolute. Then we have Alam Amr, the realm of command, the realm of the Mashiach-e-Valieh, the primal will. Then we have Alam Haq, the realm of creation, or universal nature, those universal laws that bind all things, and the archetypal realities, which are the intelligible forms of essences, which then have individual or concrete realizations in individual beings. So for example, there is an idea in the primal will, say, for the carbon atom, or for hydrogen, or for a star, or for a lion, or a giraffe, right? And in the actual history of the universe, there are instances and embodiments of this which might come and go. But they were always already pre-contained in the vision of the world, conceived by the thought of God as externalized in this logos. And this creation itself has levels or different participations in higher orders of reality. And the highest things in the created realm have more existence or more power or more goodness and encompass the lower levels. So the lowest level would simply be this pure matter or atomic reality, and then it ascends in these more emergent structures.
I really appreciate the effort to cover all of that in one in one kind of paragraph. That's really it's quite impressive. Okay, what changes with this picture after the emergence of the scientific revolution? Because I can think of a number of elements that would make things more difficult in terms of how Avicenna's philosophy was cast during his time. Um, Say, for example, the notion of autopoiesis, that you have self-organizing dynamics. Self-organizing dynamics, to some extent, um almost look to me as, the sort of it's self-formation in a way. So, well, the whole argument of Avicenna is based on the idea of causes, and one of the causes is one that gives existence, right? And that's a difficult one to argue against in many ways. But there is a notion in which um, the God of Avicenna, for example, is immutable, like never the essence of it. Well, the reality of it is unchanging. Um, but then I guess somebody could ask, if you have self-organizing dynamics, couldn't you have like potentiality being actualized at the same time through self-organizing dynamics? So basically, the God of Whitehead has some kind of degree of self-organizing dynamics, which makes it a very different theory. And I think some of that discussion comes from modern science, and some of that discussion also maybe brings into question the notion of linear causality or of causality itself, which is something you've covered. Um, I'm trying to think what like infinite regression as well. Infinite regression might be like challenged to some extent. Yeah. So go on. I'm just wondering whatever your thoughts are.
Yeah. I think there are many ways to go from here. With respect to the scientific revolution, we would find that yes, I think that when you get to a thing, eventually when you get to kind of what Occam first, right, in the 14th century, I'm going to eventually get to thinkers like Francis Bacon and the like. There is increasing skepticism in the way in which our concepts can accurately map reality, and that we have to have some empirical notion which has more or less probability of being true, but which does not have this deductive certainty. Now, of course, this was not the conception of the rationalist thinkers like Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza. It was thought that you could come to a series of first principles and then deduce the full nature of physical reality from those first principles. And that doesn't quite work. And that's why Cartesian physics doesn't work, whatever you might say for his metaphysics. And that's why you might criticize the metaphysical structure of Leibniz as being internally coherent, but altogether fanciful. So we do have to look at the world, right, in order to know more about it. We can't deduce everything from simple logical or metaphysical principles. But what we can deduce from metaphysical principles is the general structure of reality, and those principles would be assumed by any empirical science. You cannot construct an experiment without assuming that the principle of causality is legitimate, because I'm constructing a scenario, and my beliefs are affected by what I observe. And if my conclusions are not meaningfully caused or occasioned by the information I have received, then I would not be able to even affirm or assent to the belief. So you see that the very structure of rational inquiry assumes that some things cause other things. And we can know this by certainly. I am certain that my belief in the conclusion is adequately caused by my apprehension of the premises. And if, in fact, it is not adequately caused by my apprehension of the premises, I have not come to a rational belief. But if I cannot come to a rational belief, then I'm not able to advance any rational argument against the principle of causality. So you see, really, the principle of causality is something which is indubitable, because any rejection of it would undermine any rational case against it. We just have to accept it. I would also say that the scientific revolution, or really some philosophers after it, such as David Hume, give us an antiquated or diminished idea of causality as simply the juxtaposition of discrete events. And this is not what the Avicennian or Aristotelian idea of causality is, because he has a robust picture of causality. First, you have the material cause, or you have some potentiality or potency in some substrate to receive it. You have the form, which is the nature of a thing, or the formal organization by which something is rendered determinate. You have a final cause, or its innate directionality towards a certain end. And you have the efficient cause, which is not merely something which is occasioned, which is juxtaposed, as one event is juxtaposed with another, but which is the explanation of its formal quality and also its existence. So, and true causality is in fact simultaneous to the thing, right? It's not there has to be some account for where my existence comes right now. For example, David Hume thinks it's just a matter of incident that if you throw a brick through the window and it breaks, that somehow the breaking of the window and the brick going through it are just juxtaposed. We actually don't know what mystical connection it seems here. It's simply by habit that we think that one is the cause of one or the other. But really, the brick hitting the window and window breaking is one event, and one is a logical concomitant of the other. So I would say that this kind of skepticism towards causality and this diminishment of the idea of causality to a mere juxtaposition of events, which we, by virtue of a certain habit that we have, think of in terms of dependency and independence. I would say this diminishment of the idea of the cause isn't ultimately justified and would lead us to lose the ability to advance any rational argument in the first place. One thing that you mentioned is this infinite regress idea. And the question is, why can't you just have infinite causes that go back eternally? And Avicenna and thinkers like him, such as Maimonides and Aquinas in the philosophical traditions of the Abrahamic religions, which received the thought of Aristotle and Plato, make a principal distinction. So you can have an infinite sequence that goes back in time. So for example, there could be an infinite sequence of fathers and sons and mothers and daughters, given infinite time. And in fact, the Baha'i says there is indeed an eternal creation. But what you can't have is an infinite sequence of causes that exist all at once, right? Without some necessary ground. Because then you wouldn't have an explanation for the existence of that eternal chain. Because it's something that exists all at once and needs to be accounted for now. So for example, I right now am not depending on my father in order to keep existing. Right? If my father were to then cease to exist, I would immediately cease to exist. So it's a very different kind of causal chain that we're talking about. And I think that various illustrations can point to the principal distinction between this. If you think in terms of just like points in space, if you draw a point here, you could just draw another point here, another point here, but another point here. It could go infinitely given infinite space. But if you wanted, say, to suspend a chain from a ceiling, you note that every link in the chain is only able to be held up by virtue of the fact that it's held up by another chain. But the question is, what if the chain just went infinitely and there was just no ceiling? Well, obviously, it would just fall down. If it circled back on itself even, it would not be able to support its own weight. There has to be something that stands by itself that can give support to the chain. So if it doesn't terminate in something which can just support it, then at no point would the chain actually, any link of the chain actually receive the necessary strength in order to stand up. Just like the sequence of mirrors. It doesn't matter if you give me an infinite sequence of mirrors. If there's not something outside the sequence to give it light, the entire series of mirrors would have no illumination, no matter how long it goes. And therefore, in order to explain the light that any one mirror has, even if it's proximately dependent on just another member of the series, you have to go outside the series. So the question is, since no contingent being has existence in and of itself, since the chain of contingent causes is infinite, at no point would existence actually be conferred. At no point would the causal chain be able to exist. as a whole, it would be merely potentially existent.
Thank you for that one.
Leibniz actually has a beautiful way of saying this. It would be like, imagine you borrowed a book, right? And your friend borrowed the book and borrowed the book and borrowed the book. Now, would it be an explanation of the book's existence if you said there was simply no, let's say nobody wrote the book and it had no author? Would you have adequately, or you claimed the book had no author, nobody wrote the book? Would it adequately explain the book if you simply said that there's an infinite change of borrowers and lenders?
I see what you mean. Okay.
So it doesn't matter if there's an infinite chain of just contingent causes giving existence which they have borrowed, right, as a lender. The very fact of existence has not been explained. And this can only be explained if there's a first point which terminates the chain and gives existence to the rest so that it can be transitively conferred and passed on.
Okay, and in this manner of argument, I mean, you repeat in a sense Avicenna in the sense that existence becomes, but you're identifying what we call God, starting from the notion of contingent and existence. So how do you justify what exists, basically? You start from that question, and you go through that line of reasoning that there must be a cause for the existence of the contingent that is not contingent.
Exactly.
And you follow that line.
We can talk about process theology because I think it's very important. So much rides on this word contingent because the thing is contingent if it's contingent on something else to be what it is, right? Without A, B would not be what it is, right? And this whole world is filled with contingency. I mean, conditions on conditions on conditions. Contingent also means possible, right? It's contingent. It could fail to be how it is. And therefore, to be the way it is, there has to be some cause or some explanation.
So you mean it has potentiality and actuality? When you
Yes.
say possible, yeah.
It's
Just
actual in a certain way, but it's intrinsically potential, and that potentiality has to be actualized. This coffee is a certain temperature. It could have failed to be this temperature and to be another temperature. The fact that it has the warmth it has is because it was made with boiling water, and that energy came from the electricity, and that energy came from this and this and this. But for any one fact, there's an explanation for that fact, and why it is one way as opposed to another, something that makes it determinate. Now, the ultimate cause cannot be contingent in any way, because if he were one way but could have been another way, then he is not adequate to himself to explain what he is. There would have to be some external cause. So if God is out there discovering himself, if God is on a journey of self-actualization and self-perfection, if he requires creation in order to evolve into his highest levels, then he is not an adequate explanation for that creation. They would form a dual entity, which itself is contingent, could have failed to be otherwise, which is immutable, and would require a higher absolute deity. What we would be talking about is not God. And however much it might be attractive to think that God is growing with us, that God is a creator who creates in order to realize his own potentialities, a God who needs us in this fundamental way, is a fundamental mistake, and actually embroils that deity with the evil and the finitude of this world, because it means that he is not absolved from it, that there is no place in which there is a perfect and transcendental peace. There is no place which is truly an ultimate truth, beauty, and goodness. There's nothing which is ultimately and totally above imperfection and deficiency. It would mean that the author of this world is deficient in himself, does not have the full possession of the true and the good and the beautiful, is not always already what we all yearn to possess, which is the infinite, an infinite being in existence. So it would not be properly God. It would be a demiurge. It would be an archon. It would be something of this kind.
okay, but here is the little question I have about this explanation for myself, and it's not a very philosophical point of view, but I'm going to connect this to literature. I remember reading parts of Dune Messiah, which is a science fiction novel
I've
with
read all
Mom.
the Dune books, so you've got
Okay, so Dune Messiah, you have this idea of, let's say, a sovereign ruler uh, that can stay in power for a very long time, thousands of years. That's all I want to say about that here. And they are extremely bored. They're literally aching for some instance of creativity and novelty. And so the image of the God of Avicenna, with whom on philosophical principles I don't disagree in many ways, it ends up in this God that is, it's a pure intellect, knows everything from the very beginning, is unchanging. It doesn't actualize in any way because it's fully formed, developed. It cannot develop in any other way. Uh, and you almost feel like asking, well, what is it that they enjoy about that existence, in which everything is known, and there is no change, there is nothing more than what it is, and so that's kind of like emotionally my questions about that's my question about that kind of description. And I'm trying to think, is there a way to think of it in other ways? And there's two ways I kind of start to think about it. I don't know if that can go anywhere. One is there's a statement from Abdul Baha that says something along the lines of the reality of the divinity is sanctified above singleness, then how much more above plurality. And singleness is quite an important attribute even in Avicenna's work. So that to me is maybe potentially could be interpreted as questioning even these fundamental principles that we have about divinity, which then puts you in a completely different spin because it puts in a position of, well, I'm not sure. This is as far as we go, but maybe these are just our categories, and they can only go so far. Uh, so that's one side of it, and I don't know where you can take that kind of direction. The other part is, I think that in a sense, the way Avicenna has argued is in a general sense the way many philosophers have argued, which is, in my view, to kind of just ask, okay, we are imperfection. What is perfection? What would perfection look like? And then by trying to identify perfection in a very rational, very, by which I mean very organized, systematic, philosophical way, so for really proper thinking and inspiration, different philosophers and different religions arrive at this kind of notion of one reality, uh, in the manner that Avicenna describes it, and out of that they arrive at some kind of theory of emanation, because you cannot really, once you reach that kind of level that perfection can never be something like us, um, then you have to explain, if perfection is something that can never be associated with us, how can we be created through, like, what, if there is no tie, where does creation come from? And the only, like, kind of logical answer to that would be some theory of emanation of some type. I mean, there are other theories, but this is a sophisticated, maybe the most sophisticated one, uh, for several thousand years at least. Yeah, do you want to come in?
There are several questions here which are separate and distinct, so I think we should take them one by one. One is the question of the deity being static and bored. But first, I think we have to be very clear here that the idea of God as eternal, immutable, immaterial, absolute, and unconditioned, a God who doesn't undergo any succession of state, is not merely the deity which Avicenna deduced on rational principles, but is in fact the divinity which has been explicitly established by, whose nature has been explicitly established by Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha. There's no process theology in the faith. Baha'u'lláh is absolutely clear that God, and he opens the Epistle of the Son of the Wolf saying that he's the God, but absolutely beyond any change whatsoever. And countless passages from Baha'u'lláh, which have been collected by Dr. Ali Murad Dawoodi in his book, The Divinity and Manifestation, is outside time and space. And Abdu'l-Baha very clearly in Some Answered Questions says any of the accidents or properties impinging on contingent beings are utterly absent in the divinity. There is no change whatsoever. Baha'u'lláh is also very clear that God does not require his creation in the sense that he gets anything from it. He says even if everybody were to disbelieve in God, he would not be at all affected. He would not be at all offended. There's no diminishment which could possibly attach to him. It's simply for the good of the creature that he creates. Creation is a necessary overflow of God, just like the emanation of rays is a necessary overflow from the sun. But the sun doesn't need its rays in the sense that it requires something from them, that it gets anything out of them. But I would say that you might be surprised when you delve into Avicenna that he thinks that so far as we could understand the impossible, which is the interior experience of God, it is one of infinite and unceasing ecstasy. So Avicenna thinks that pleasure arises when a faculty, a power, is actualized by a suitable object. So you can imagine, your sense of taste has pleasure when it perceives sugar. Sugar is a suitable object and it's actualized. Or you could say your sense of touch, right? If it's too cold and it's actualized by warmth, that's a pleasure. And so we can understand that, and when a need is satiated, say hunger, we eat, and then there's satiety, there's pleasure, or when there's a craving of some kind or other. So when a lust is satisfied, in the moments before satiety, it is a great ecstasy, perhaps. But Avicenna thinks all these pleasures fall far short of an intellectual pleasure, because he says when the mind conceives a beautiful object, the union of the object and the faculty has a perfect and complete penetration, and the mind almost becomes the very thing conceived. So I think that there are many times when we have a great happiness just in the discovery of the truth, or when we're engaged in something. We have all of us been engrossed, say, in a philosophical or intellectual problem, and we find great pleasure in our attention towards it. So for Avicenna, God doesn't have any succession of state, remember. Just like Boethius said in the 5th century, eternity is the possession all at once of illimitable life. So for God, there's no past and no future. He cannot get tired of himself, since that would suggest that he had himself, and then some time passes and he wishes that he had some other experience. He is always already what he has always been. But this is not static, right? Something is static if it needs to change, if there's some higher level at which it could attain, but it's stuck at a certain level. So God is infinite being and infinite perfection. And since he's immaterial and a mind, he immediately apprehends himself in his perfection, his illimitable, his infinite beauty, truth, and goodness. And his apprehension of that beauty, truth, and goodness is concomitant to a commensurate pleasure, which is an infinite pleasure. And his very idea and pleasure in himself is not something distinct from his very existence. This is why Avicenna says he is at once lover, since he loves himself and his infinite being, and beloved, since he is loved by himself. But in his absolute simplicity, he is also the very consummate act of love. He says that he is the pleasure, the lezat, and the motaz and the molez. He is the pleasure and the thing delighted in, and the taker of delight. So this picture is that logic and love are ultimately one because God is an intellect who knows himself. So he is the knower, the known thing, and the act of knowledge. But because he is good and beautiful and true, this knowledge is accompanied by love and pleasure. So he is lover, beloved, and beloved. He is lover, beloved, and active love. So for Avicenna, the ultimate reality is this wellspring of infinite existence, of goodness, beauty, and perfection, which in knowing itself loves itself and is not separate from this act of love. So the fundament of reality is a consummate act of love, which in its bounteousness and generosity overflows into the emanation of all other things. God is a perfection of infinite intensity, and it overflows in the sharing and diffusion of existence until we get to the lowest stage, which is matter, which is the most tenuous hold on existence, right? But it's just the lowest level of an emanation that has an infinite source. So this is not a static God, right? There is constancy. He is always already there. He is and must be. There's nothing that he could be that he is not already. For anything that he could be, he already is necessarily. But there's no way that he could ever be bored or ever be tired. And that is why he is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the beginning and the end. And if it is difficult for us to apprehend this, it is because we are finite and contingent beings. There will be no point at which we stop. And we may never transcend our human degree, our human level, as Abdul Baha says, but within our level, there are infinite perfections. And there will always within us be this hunger for the absolute. And we will never encompass and contain God, but we'll always be drawn towards him. And that's why our progression is everlasting.
Is there a theme of return in Avicenna? Like in the mystical return?
Avicenna does not affirm the doctrine of reincarnation and has arguments against it.
Not reincarnation, like returning to the idea that, like the seven values, that you basically, so the arc of descent and arc of ascent, the idea that you return to God in some way, not God itself maybe, but some aspect of divinity.
Definitely. And he talks about this rather beautifully. I mean, the soul emanates from God. It's an immaterial reality, but it animates a body, and our first experience is in this material world. So you could say just in the development of the human, we start in something that's not unlike a pure mineral existence, and then becomes a plant, and then an animal. Then we exercise our rational faculties. But he thinks that the more that we progress, and the more that we conceive the structure of reality, we become, as he says, an olama aqli, an intelligible world. In the human mind is reflected the very structure of the universe. And as we get to higher levels of reality, to include the first cause, what we conceive of the cosmos reflects the providential idea that God had from eternity of the world. And since God's idea of the world as the maximal diffusion of his own perfections is somehow his idea of himself in a way, his idea of himself in terms of how he could at most maximally share and diffuse his own perfections. The more we comprehend the providential structure of reality for Avicenna, the more we reflect God, the more that we manifest God, the more our mind contains the divine thought and the divine ideas. So, of course, there is this structure. Creation emanates from God in this downward arc, and everything is yearning for God and is reaching for perfection. And the human being is the one reality which begins at the nadir, which begins at the lowest point of materiality, but which is destined to ascend to the highest point. And for Avicenna, there's no physical resurrection of the dead, and therefore death signals a liberation if we inculcate in ourselves virtues as stable dispositions of the soul. And he believes that those who have trained themselves to delight in spiritual and in intelligible realities will have an ecstasy in the next life. And it is only those who are attached to this world which will experience pain, as they no longer have bodies by which to satisfy their passions and their appetites. So, for example, if our highest delight in this world was sexual activity, or the taste of a Reuben sandwich. In the next life, we'd be very discomfited by virtue of being deprived of those goods. But in fact, if we found that our highest delights were of a spiritual and intelligible nature, then there would be great ecstasy. I think also the Baha'i faith, teachings of Baha'u'lláh show that we're in communion with spirits in the next life. And we progress through infinite worlds of God. I think that the divisions that we have interpersonally in the next life can dissolve, at least with souls of our own level, because there will be no physical barriers or obstacles between us. So I think that even as light passes between two panes of glass, thoughts will pass between souls in the next life, and we'll have a true mutual understanding and communion. And accompanying this true communion and intercourse will be the highest of spiritual pleasures.
Thank you again. Let's talk a bit about the names and attributes of God. I have all sorts of questions about that, and I haven't really seen much written about it, at least not in the Baha'i scholarship. Are names and attributes something that you would ascribe to divinity? So the first aspect of divinity, the first cause, not the primal will. And if so, how do we think of them? Because do they have a beginning? Are they eternal themselves? There is no change there. Are they staying the same, or is there a change? So that's one set of questions. And then maybe you can touch on how creation comes into being, and what's the role of names and attributes, because I think that's kind of the tissue that connects both the ideas of spiritual nature and creation on one hand, and also the idea of moving from potentiality to actuality, right? So it's for a middle term, it's a really important term to figure out, and maybe we haven't given it as much attention as we could have.
Excellent. One author who has written best on this theme is Dr. Ali Mullah Dawoodi. Now, he was a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran before the Islamic Revolution. He was subsequently martyred following his kidnapping and disappearance. And he was a professor of philosophy at the University of Tehran, the first to earn a PhD in philosophy. So he wrote Uluhiyat wa Mazhariyat, which is Divinity and Manifestation. It has recently been translated by Naeem Nabil Akbar and by myself, and it's coming out in George Ronald. And he talks about, he goes deeply into this question of the names and attributes of God and what it means. So we think about God having various names and various attributes. Now, unlike some thinkers in the history of Islamic philosophy, what Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha teach is that these names and attributes in his essence are not separate and discrete entities or properties. So it is wrong to think that God has one property, wisdom, which is separate and distinct from his will, his knowledge, or his power. In him, these are all one and in fact identical to his existence. So what the names and attributes of God are the different perfections of existence. Now, the perfections of existence are just perfect being in God himself. But as reality emanates from God, this existence takes on multiplicity because it becomes diffracted in numerous beings with their various properties. So for us, knowledge and wisdom and will and causal power are separate and distinct, but in God they are not. But insofar as we possess these faculties and these perfections, we give evidence to God. What in him is one and absolute, and thus becomes many and varied. But nonetheless, these names and attributes nonetheless reflect him. Another way of thinking about attributes is that they are negations of any imperfection. And Abdu'l-Baha talks about this quite a bit. So for example, we say that God is immutable. That is to say, he doesn't change. Because we recognize that if something can change, it means that it's either getting worse or it's getting better in some way, or it's being affected. But if it's getting worse, that means that it has an imperfection. It can get worse. It's subject to this weakness and debilitation. If it's getting better, it doesn't already always possess what it ought to be and requires external means. So it's an imperfection. This is not compatible with the ultimate reality. So therefore, he is immutable. He's not in time and space, right? Because if he is in time, he could have changed. If he's in space, then he's a limited and finite being, right? With a boundary, which is not appropriate to the divinity. Wherefore, he is eternal. And as the ultimate cause of anything that exists, he is omnipotent. Since if you have power, you can do something. You have an active potency, right? But you can't have any power if you don't have first existence. And all existence comes from God. So all power comes from God. So he is the source of all power because he is the source of all existence and his existence itself, right? In us, knowledge is not had by every existent, but only by those higher orders of being. So an animal has consciousness and perception. We have knowledge since we can apprehend a concept, and we apprehend that we apprehend the concept, and that's knowledge. Now, God is purely intellectual. He's a purely intellective being, and he immediately knows himself, and he knows himself as infinite existence and infinite power. So he knows everything that can be created by him. And his very idea of those things he can create is his act of creating them. He knows what he can create. He knows that they are good, and his very knowledge of that, his very plan and idea, is sufficient to create those things, since he is infinite existence and doesn't require any external means by which to enact a creation. So it's kind of like the poet meditating upon his own creative powers can conceive of a poem, and his very conception of the poem is his creating it. But other creators, let's say the carpenter, can conceive an idea for a table, and then he has to will to create the table as good, and then he has to use various means by which to actualize his power in the world to actually construct a table, right? But God doesn't require these steps. For God, the knowledge of himself includes the knowledge of anything he can create. He conceives one universe as best expressive of his perfection, and his very conception of that thing includes will of that thing, and his very will of that thing is the immediately effective and efficient cause for the actual creation of that thing through the primal will. So in God, these are not separate and distinct powers and properties. They're absolutely one with his essence. But as existence emanates, it takes on the aspect of multiplicity. So everything that exists manifests God in giving some sign and indication of him. The rock manifests God insofar as it is an index and token of his existence. It exists, it points to God insofar as it exists. The plant too, and the animal too, the human being too. So we know that whatever exists in the effect has to somehow exist in the cause. So we know that whatever perfections of power, of goodness, of will, and intellect we only have because it's originally given to us by an ultimate cause. Therefore, any perfection that we have pre-exists in God in a certain way, but always in a higher way and in the matter of pure simplicity. Before we forget, we should probably get to the reference of Abdu'l-Bahá that God is above even singleness, because I think that it could be misconstrued as saying that God is so beyond our concepts that, in fact, we're basically atheists or agnostic, right? We can't even. I don't think that's the point. The point is this: that Abdu'l-Bahá is affirming something that Avicenna or St. Thomas Aquinas or Maimonides or any of the philosophers would have said, and it's that God is not a finite being with an essence. Because the whole point here is that there's a distinction between essence and existence, such that anything which has an essence or nature, such as man, which is a rational animal, or a triangle, which is a plane figure of three sides, has a nature which we conceptually can distinguish from its existence, right? And therefore, you have to have a cause to give existence to the essence triangle so it can actually be concretely realized. But God just is his existence. But you can think about if you have an essence, like human being, rational animal, well, you can have multiple instances of that kind of being. There are many different humans. We're one in the sense of having one human nature. There's only one humanity. But there are many human beings, right? Now imagine the state of oneness that you would have if you had one human being, because the rest of humanity was extinguished and rendered extinct, but you just had one man left. He would be one man, right? But of course, he'd still just be a single instance of a human nature, which in principle could have multiple instantiations, right? So what Abdu'l-Bahá is saying is God's not like this. God is not a single instance of a higher type, divinity, right? In which he participates. God is just divinity itself. God being a divine thing and divinity, are not separate and distinct. So, for example, I am not humanity. I'm a human being. I'm a concrete single instance. But it is not the case that God is a God, a divine being, who is an instance of a higher type or category divinity. He just is divinity itself, right? In that sense, he's above singleness, right? Because he's beyond our concept of a singular entity in the contingent world, something that's finite and bounded. But when Abdu'l-Bahá says this, he's not saying anything whatever that Avicenna or Aquinas or Maimonides or Plotinus would have denied. What he's saying is actually rather it's philosophically sophisticated and articulate. But he's telling us, do not think that God is a single instance of a thing, that there could in principle be another deity, because there could not. He's beyond that idea of oneness. His oneness is more perfect and absolute. But he makes clear that the oneness that he has is something that we apprehend not in itself, but by way of negation. We've said that he is not one in this sense. But it's certain. But he immediately goes on to say how much more from plurality. We are right in saying that God is not multiple, and that's a true knowledge. That's not nothing. That's altogether significant.
Okay, I feel like I really like that argument, by the way. That was great. Okay, let me go further up to the primal will and kind of ask when even when you say the primal will, you think about the will of God, the name, and then I think the Baha'i writings say at least, and the Baha'i writings can oftentimes say things that seem slightly contradictory, and then you have to figure out what that means. But I think they do say that the primal will is not created by God. But at the same time, the will is a name and attribute of God. Um, that's one that seems puzzling to me. Um, and then also the idea of oneness as a sort of stage of spiritual development that is described in some of the mystical writings, like the Seven Valleys, maybe, or the Four Valleys of Baha'u'lláh, and which maybe some could interpret more on the lines of Ibn Arabi, as if, some kind of stage where everything you see God, basically. No, so that's not saying that everything you see is God. It's just saying everything, everything you see God. That also seems to somehow relate to the primal will in a way more directly than with God, the inaccessible, unknowable essence, and so forth. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well,
Beautiful. And then perhaps we can transition to what we could conceive as a philosophical case for the Baha'i faith.
yeah, if you can go in that direction.
Excellent. Because it all connects. I'd say with the Brahma will, and actually this is a broader thing. The question is, are the Baha'i writings absolutely consistent in their metaphysical propositions? Because there are some who thought that Baha'u'lláh advanced some sort of relativism with respect to this. And to me, this doesn't work philosophically, but it also doesn't work exegetically. Because I have never come across any statement of Baha'u'lláh in any theological topic which was intrinsically at variance with another statement, and which could not be rather simply resolved so long as we had the necessary concepts. So, for example, there's no conflict in the writings of Baha'u'lláh between the idea of a deity which is transcendent and a deity which is fully immanent or somehow identical with his creation. The question of identity is never present. Abdu'l-Bahá goes at length in some answered questions to refute the idea of wahdatul wujud, or a pure monism, by which we understand creation ultimately be a manifestation of God in the sense in which the tree is a manifestation of the sea, that somehow God overflows in creation and descends into the lower levels. This idea of transcendence is everywhere affirmed. Now, God is immanent in creation, present everywhere, insofar as his causal power is present everywhere, and insofar as he's not a separate and discrete item from the world, right? It's almost like, this The world adds nothing in reality in addition to God or over against him. So in this sense, you can imagine that if I form to myself the conception of a poem, well, I encompass the poem, but the poem is not identical to me, nor do I just revolve and dissolve and become the poem. But it's also the case that the poem is not something separate and distinct from me as over against me or in addition to me, right? I fully encompass it with my power. It's also the case that you could think of a light of infinite intensity. It contains all the lower levels, but never becomes a lower level of brightness in itself. The lower levels of brightness always depend on it and are contained or enveloped by it. So this is why the Baha'i writings say that God is all encompassing. So one thing is, with respect to the primal will, you can think of will and intellect as being synonymous. And philosophers often thought of them as very closely connected. So what do we mean by this? You have a will for a thing when you apprehend it as good, right? So, for example, you might will to eat the kale salad because you apprehend it as nutritious and as leading to the welfare of the human body, right? So once you apprehend it as good, you will that thing, right? So anything that has an intellect has a will. Our will is sometimes it's been called the intellectual appetite, right? We will, and it's different from just having a drive or an urge. So I might feel hunger, but I could respond to that hunger in different ways. I can decide to act, and it will depend upon my rational deliberation and my thought. So the primal will is not the will which is the identical to the essence of God, but is an external procession, and it is also an intellect. But by being an intellect, it is also a will, right? And its will and since it's a pure immaterial and spiritual entity, its mind just is itself, and its will just is itself. And I think you're very insightful when you got to this point about Ibn al-Arabi and thinking about in everything is God is seen, right? That this actually points to the station of the primal will. Because Baha'u'lláh in the Loh-i-Hikmat does describe the primal will as being manifest in nature, as nature as being the manifestation of the primal will. You could think of it as what exists in the intelligible realm is the primal will, and nature is the concrete realization of the primal will's ideas, of all the possibilities of creation. And that this is not something that we would attribute to the divine essence itself, where God's knowledge is identical to his essence and doesn't have multiplicity whatsoever. He has a single concept of himself that somehow includes everything which is consequent to him and concomitant to him and his causal power. I believe it's in the stage of the primal will that knowledge diffracts into the multiplicity of essences, say. And we can think of the primal will, as a universal mind, which has the concept of everything general and particular. And that these ideas, in the unfolding of the creation of nature over time, become concretely realized. In the same way that Mozart can conceive all at once every aspect of a symphony, can meditate upon the notes and the movements and everything. And eventually the symphony is in fact played, but his knowledge is prior to the symphony. And then any physical repetition or playing of the symphony is just a participation or reflection of the original intelligible reality.
Let me thank you again. Let me build more questions on this. Human beings attaining eternal life. How do you link that with names and attributes? Because sometimes when I think about it, and I have no ideas about this, but sometimes when I think about what I read, I think I understand something along the lines that there is a realm of names and attributes, basically, where there are several realms of names and attributes, right? But there is one which is accessible to human beings in another realm or life. And I mean, it's a question. I don't really know what I'm saying, but is there a return to names and attributes? Is that a thing? Because if you think of a name and attribute as humanity, I don't know if maybe it makes sense that once you, let's say, progress enough in your actualization of potentiality, you approach I don't know, than that particular name of humanity. Of course, when we speak of names and attributes in the Baha'i faith, we often speak of qualities and virtues. Um, and there's even a theory, not a theory, but there's even sentences that describe the human soul. And I think this is both in Islamic philosophy and in the Baha'i faith, statements where the human being is described as a configuration of names and attributes. So, like your psyche is described as a configuration of names and attributes, of which one is the most powerful or the most important, and to which you return. Do you make any sense of this? I don't, in a way, but I'm curious about it because you can use that in psychology, right? So we spent a lot of time in psychology, like Baha'is who have studied psychology and looked at psychology from the perspective of the Baha'i writings. They always speak about love, knowledge, and will. Um, Not so much about names and attributes and configuration of names and attributes, out of which one is more significant. That just would be a different avenue in many ways.
Well, certainly when human beings progress, they become more properly human. We become less animal and more rational. That is to say that our emotions and our urges and our drives and impulses are more fully subordinated to what we apprehend as good. Reason is not simply the faculty of economic cunning, but is that by which we recognize what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. And all these human virtues are reflections of the nature of the deity, but in a different way. And we don't apprehend and how they exist in God only have an analogous relationship to how they exist in us. So, for example, one human virtue is generosity, and that is the capacity by which we can give to another for their benefit out of an act of love, knowing that it is good, desiring or needing no benefit to ourselves. And this is precisely how God creates. Now, generosity in a human being is something separate and distinct from power as such. But in God, there's no misalignment between his generosity and his power because he is the power to give anything whatsoever, and he apprehends the giving as good. And his power and his giving just are a single act for him, but not for us. Likewise, for us, what we know is separate from what we can give, but God knows everything at once. He knows it as good, and he provides it by creating. So in him, they are one. But so you see, for us, we have to acquire these attributes and develop these virtues piecemeal. But as we do so, we come closer, but never totally attain the totality of the divine perfections. Now, the totality of the divine perfections, not completely one, but nonetheless assembled and collected, exist in the manifestation of God. And it's because he is a rational soul which has a special connection and illumination by the Logos, or the primal will. And this gives him an innate knowledge of the necessary relationships that bind all things. This gives him the capacity to found a religion and institutions which are appropriate to the needs of this age and which will enable human beings individually and collectively to thrive and come to a proper knowledge of their creator and their eternal and everlasting destiny. And because of his connection to the Logos and the primal will, he has not only preternatural knowledge, but moral perfection. He has a perfect integrity of the will. In him, there's no moral struggle or internal conflict. He is already what all other human beings long to become, but somehow fell short of being. And that's the image of God in man. And so Baha'u'lláh is the image of exalted and true humanity. And because he already is what we long to become, he can be our true and rightful educator.
How do you how do you link that that act actualization of potentiality to like living eternally?
Living eternally.
Like I'm trying to identify like the argument that connects those two in a
If
way.
you want an argument
Yeah.
for why we should assume that the human being, or why we should advance the idea that we have an immaterial and immortal soul, that's a separate argument. And we can have that if that's what you're gesturing toward.
I mean, I'm interested in that, but I was looking at it from the angle of if I am reflecting a name and attribute more, or a configuration of names and attributes, or whatever it is, how does that lead to kind of eternal life, as compared to not necessarily. I mean, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to even understand if the theory is that everybody has eternal life or not, or like all sorts of questions there. But I was trying to understand what is the link of argument in terms of mirroring names of God, eternal life, that kind of connection. But maybe there is no clear connection that I can think about or anyone can think about.
There
Uh,
is. The idea presented by the Baha'i writings, by Baha'u'lláh and Abu Baha, is that the degrees of human perfection are infinite and that our progress continues in the next life. It does seem that this world is a field on which we are given the chance to acquire virtues and dispositions. So, for example, we can acquire the virtue of courage, right? Now, courage is not something that you could properly say of God, since he's above having courage, because it would mean that he has to resist danger for the benefit of the community and in a way that requires the moderation of his own fear. And only a being which can be damaged can have fear. So it's not really properly an attribute of the deity, but is a human virtue. And it reflects God's goodness insofar as courage is the triumph of the rational will over the appetites and over emotions such as fear. It's not recklessness, which means not being afraid about what you ought to be afraid of. It means having the proper amount of fear and choosing what is noble over what is base. Now, for example, so that's a courage and leads to the progress and perfection of the soul, insofar as it indicates a triumph of its rational power and its moral conscience over the forces that would enslave it. But it's also a virtue that really could only be possessed in this life. So that's the way in which what we do in this life has repercussions for our state in the next life. And in the next life, there's no physicality, there's no body which could act as a veil to immediately beholding the state of our soul and its perfection or its disfigurement. So any attachment to what is base and any desire for what is base, which could not be satisfied in the next life, would be immediately apparent to us. And the beholding thereof would be painful or suffering of a spiritual kind. It also seems that there are infinite worlds of God, and that as so long as we have an orientation toward the good and the true and the beautiful, the more we will be able to receive goodness and beauty and truth and conceive it and want it. So it seems like there's a capacity to become ever fuller receptacles of the light, so long as we have a will for it. It is difficult to conceive of interaction, right? And a lot of our moral life in this life is how we deal with others. But it seems like there is a reciprocity and mutuality possible in the next life, and that we'll have a better taste of it then. But this is abstract unless and until we have an actual taste of it, which cannot happen to the moment of death. But it does seem, remember, I think that's why it's given to us in analogies, right? In the womb, we cannot conceive of this world, right? But in fact, what we develop in the womb is preparatory for that world. And then we have powers and perfections which are only apparent to us when we're born. So it seems, for example, what we do now in our efforts to understand the intelligible structure of reality, well, in the next life we'll be able to have a fuller grasp of the true structure of reality. So, for example, our knowledge will increase, and our will to have a greater knowledge will increase, and perhaps our goodness can increase insofar as we can be agents for the transformation and evolution of other spirits. Baha'u'lláh is very clear that the progress of this world is linked to the activities of spirits in the next who help. So perhaps, in fact, we can be ministers of grace and angelic actors in this world and the next life. So we can have a will for the good, which is, in fact, positively enacted. And that would be a generosity. So it seems to me that there are infinite ways in which we could develop the virtues that we begin to have in this life.
Thank you. So it's almost like part of what you're saying is, um, development in this philosophical theological scheme is across different worlds.
Yes.
So it's not just this world and then you move to an eternal life stage. Is eternal life is part of the development sequence.
I think here we can never get bored because we have an everlasting existence, but we're not eternal, right? God is simply outside time. There's no succession of state. Even when we're a pure immaterial being, there will be a succession of state. There's no progress without change of some kind. So even in the material world, time is relative. So I think it might be hard to say, what does 1,000 years feel like for an immaterial soul? But there seems to be some succession of state, right? But insofar as there are infinite worlds of God to explore, metaphysical planes, and insofar as there are infinite perfections to have, we'll never be bored. At the same time, there will never be a time, it seems, in which we just have it all. It seems like it's an asymptotic curve.
Thank you. Let's talk a bit about Ibn Arabi. When I was reading your paper on Avicenna, you were mentioning quite a number of Bahá'í scholars that have at least mentioned Avicenna. I think Jan Kluge and Juan Col, maybe. You also mentioned that others, Mojan Muman, I think was the example, had mentioned Ibn Arabi. I also happen to know a little bit more about, I mean, I knew nothing about Avicenna and I know very little about Ibn Arabi, but reading a little bit about Ibn Arabi has really helped me make a bit more sense about the names and attributes, and others have maybe highlighted the idea that the cosmology as seems to appear in some of the Babi writings. So the question I have is, what kind of philosophers do you think are important for engaging with this tradition of Baha'i thought? Because I think that if you approach even reading an accessible book like Hidden Words without any of these philosophers in your background to some degree, it can be very difficult to understand what's going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we begin with Aristotle and we begin with Plato and Socrates, as Bahá'u'lláh does in Tablet Wisdom. I would say if you want to know what Baha'i metaphysics is, I think it's Neoplatonic metaphysics and Neoplatonist theme, or the Ur-Platonism, the basic Platonism that some scholars like Lloyd Gerson have talked about, which is basically, anti-reductionism, anti-materialism, anti-nominalism, and other anti-physicalism and other things. The idea that there is an ultimate reality and that mentality, that mind is primary to matter, right? And other theses are connected with it. I think then but I accept the thesis of the great 20th century philosopher and Thomist thinker Etienne Gilson that the revelation of the biblical and Quranic revelation added a core insight to the Greek tradition of philosophy through Plato and Aristotle, in that God is not only the source of the intelligible order of the world, or even just the supreme actualizer of motion, but that God is the very giver of existence to the world, being as such, right? That's a core insight. So I think how this tradition is received and adapted by the theistic philosophers is core. So in Christianity, so I think a Jewish thinker, in the first century BC, like Philo of Alexandria, is important. And then a thinker like Plotinus, who's considered the founder of Neoplatonism, although he just considered himself a Platonist. And then I think in terms of Christianity, an early theologian like Origen is important in the second century, I believe. And then St. Augustine, right, in the fourth and fifth centuries. And then later on, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. But Aquinas has already been influenced by Maimonides and by Avicenna and by Farabi. So I think Avicenna is just very important because before Avicenna, when you had Muslims working with the Greek tradition of philosophy, which was accessible to them because through the Greek translation movement in Baghdad, in the 8th and 9th centuries of the Greek philosophical texts, in which you have philosophical circles, starting with Al-Kindi and then going to Farabi and the like. Avicenna remarks the point at which an Aristotelian tradition of philosophy gets at a new level, because he was able to bring everything into such a startling new synthesis, and it was able to imbue it with certain ideas characteristic of his own thought, that after Avicenna, Avicenna becomes, as it were, a second Aristotle. People are responding principally to Avicenna, not to Aristotle, and that's remarkable. And it includes not only philosophers as such, right, who think that their principal method is the rational method, but also dialectical theologians of the Asherite school, right, who wanted to base their doctrines also principally on the data of Scripture and to use rational arguments in addition to it. After Avicenna, they have to respond to Avicenna, and thinkers like Ghazali, in fact, did much to absorb Avicennian ideas and to use Avicennian ideas to promulgate Islamic thought. So by the time you get to a thinker like Ibn Arabi, it's no longer pure mysticism or pure asceticism like we find the original Sufism to have been in Baghdad, and it mixes with a variety of traditions, but it has an irreducibly contemplative or theoretical element. This intellectual or theoretical element is continued by Ibn Arabi's successors, like Sadruddin Hunabi. And it also and this intellectual tradition is also influenced by Persian poetry and literature, right, which is the aesthetic dimension. But already with the followers of Ibn Arabi, they're beginning to express their ideas in an Avicennian language, and they might have a different kind of interpretation of many of these terms, but they're using Avicenna. So it's not that Ibn Arabi is something over and against or opposed to Avicenna. They're still they are a distinct but related community of discourse, the school of Ibn Arabi and a more Avicennian direction. And then you have syntheses, right? And different directions. So Sohrawardi has the illuminationist philosophy, which is a response to Avicenna, and he has his own distinctive ideas. And then you have Ibn Arabi, and then you eventually have a thinker like Mullah Sandra in the 17th century, who draws from Sohrawardi and who's read his Avicenna and his Ibn Arabi. And the Baha'i faith receives all of this. And I think the best thinkers, in a sense, were proto-Baha'is. The Baha'i faith is a religion which has a passionate and mystical element. It is the encounter with Baha'u'lláh as the Insan Kamil, the perfect man. But it also has a rational foundation and rational structure, and it affirms many of the ideas of the philosophers. So I think a lot of the ideas of Ibn Arabi are helpful, right? Because they are language and terms which Baha'u'lláh uses. But that doesn't mean that we accept wholesale every metaphysical position of Ibn Arabi, just as we don't accept wholesale every position of Avicenna. I do find, though, and I think this is very important, that on very important issues, what Baha'u'lláh affirms, I think, is more Avicennian than Ibn Arabian, and I can get into this. But also to reflect, when I said this Neoplatonic kind of structure of reality, that's seen in both, right? There's an absolute and an emanated structure, and Ibn Arabi is obsessed with this idea of the different stages, right? So he thinks that they're just like this Hazrat, the five presences, and this is articulated in different ways by his followers. But there is the absolute deity, the unknowable essence. Then the next stage is the divine knowledge, say what God knows, and these are the eternal archetypes or forms. Then there's the creator. There's this procession of existence. This is the idea of reality that we find in the Neoplatonists. Plotinus thinks that there is the one, who he thinks of as above being, that is finite being, and then the first procession is the nous. Then you have the soul, and then you have nature. So to me, it's Neoplatonist metaphysics, and this Neoplatonist metaphysics is the eternal faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. It's the perennial philosophy. It's what any consistent use of the rational faculty will eventually have. But it's not complete unless and until we apprehend the figure who gives us the perfected vision of humanity, who is the Logos as manifest to us, and that's the person of the manifestation of God.
there's two questions I feel we could continue with. You have to prioritize considering the time you have. So at the beginning of the interview, I was mentioning that you might have things to say in relation to the video Stephen Phelps and Nate Grant had in September. So that's one thing. The other part is I'm really curious now to hear about more about Avicenna and Ibn Arabi. So it depends which one you feel you want to go into, or if you can tackle both.
Mm, mm. I think one aspect of it is this. You could think Mullah Sandra, I think, takes sort of an idea of Ibn Arabi's, where he thinks that God is existence at its infinite intensity, and all other things are just limited or diminished intensities of existence or containers of existence. So, but I think one mistake here that we could make is that when we say that a contingent being exists, its existence is really just the same thing as God's existence, right? In which case you could say that God is just existence and it just has these different manifestations or these different forms. It's taking on these shapes and everything. Some of the followers of Ibn Arabi think about this, that like nothing passes in and out of existence. It's just existence manifesting in a certain way, and ultimately it's just one. God is existence itself, so there's just one existence, right? And this multiplicity is almost illusory, right? And this would be to have too pantheistic a notion of the deity. Avicenna says that that existence doesn't have doesn't have a single meaning, but it's also the case that when we say different things exist, it might not mean exactly the same thing, but it doesn't have a totally unrelated meaning to either. It exists by analogy. So, for example, when I say that 6 inches or say 4 inches exists in this cup, the way in which 4 inches exists is a different way than the cup exists. 4 inches exists as in a subject in the cup, and the cup exists in its own right. It's not in a subject. So they exist in a different way. Existence means something different. So I exist, but the way I exist means something rather different than the way in which God exists. So it's a single concept, but it can be modulated by analogy. It's not the same thing. So I think that when we talk about God's existence, he is not the existence that every individual thing formally possesses. So, for example, when I say God is existence itself, it doesn't mean the existence of this cup just is God. That somehow this is just way in which one existence manifests itself. The cup has a level of reality, and its mode of reality is separate and distinct, and less than the absolute reality. At the same time, God encompasses all things. But I think that this idea of transcendence and immanence, this idea that God is absolutely beyond, but somehow all encompasses everything. Both ideas are to be affirmed, and they are by Baha'u'lláh. But one reason this more relativistic idea of Baha'i metaphysics simply doesn't work is simply not how Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'lláh portrayed. Baha'u'lláh there's actually a rather remarkable passage in Gleanings in which he gives an interpretation of the poem or the verse of a poem by the Persian poet Sa'di that says in which he says that it is to be wondered at that I am so far from God when nobody is closer to me than him. He is as close to me as my life being. And Baha'u'lláh says that they have made a mistake who think that there are not levels of reality, and that everything is just a partner with God in a sense of just being a manifestation of God. And he insists that there are actually levels and distinctions of reality. So for us, the multiplicity and distinction among things is not merely illusory, it is real. So Baha'u'lláh says that look upon your own selves and compare your eyes and your fingernails. For you pare away the one, you cut away the one, and you preserve the other even as your life. This is not an illusory distinction. And Abdu'l-Baha, in some answered questions on the question of Wahdatul Wujud or pantheism, simply denies the arguments of the Sufis for the identity of creation or nature in God, because their argument is that, well, in God there is a knowledge of the essences of all things, and these essences are ultimately identical to his essence, therefore all things simply are identical with God. And we would say no. In God, his knowledge is absolutely one, And then he emanates the primal will, and it's at the primal will that the knowledge can diffract into a multiplicity of essences, and then it can be concretely realized in the world. And everywhere, God's transcendence is affirmed. He is an ultimate existence, which can give reality to anything beyond him, but his existence itself is never shaped or modulated or modified or manifested as the things that he creates.
Do you?
Is there anything specifically in the interview between Dr. Phelps and Nate Grant that you were curious about? I would say, well, they're both prodigious intellects, and they impressed me very much. I have had it was my pleasure to meet Nate Grant at the conference in June at Greenacre, or as which was organized by the Corinne True Center for the Study of Baha'i History. And I thought he was altogether insightful with respect to this idea of Hegelian ideas and thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and how Baha'i thought gives us a mechanism to transcend kind of this idea, and which is really which really involves violence and power in the final analysis. And I think that it would be hard to find somebody who has a greater grasp of the actual extent of the Baha'i revelation than Stephen Phelps. And saying that, there probably are some differences of emphasis in how the three of us might approach certain topics. I would say, I think I cannot speak for him, but I know that Nate Grant expressed to me that he thinks that your reason is altogether important and we can make a rational case for the faith. But eventually there is something that the will is not might not be so determined by the intellect, that there's not an element that has to go beyond reason to like a pure experience. And I think Dr. Phelps is probably a bit more skeptical about the reach of our rational faculties. And for him, the transcendence of the deity and its unknowability leads to something that's more agnostic in the Baha'i position, or a bit more relativistic. And for me, I would say that I'm just simply a rationalist. And I think that there's no point at which rationality can be rescinded. I think that it is beneath the dignity of man to have any belief which does not have a rational foundation. I think ultimately logic and love are one, because the faculty by which we apprehend what is true and good is a faculty by which we love. But to me, I'm a Baha'i because I think it's the most rational worldview that one could possibly have, and that I'm not so much given abundant reasons by which to accept Baha'u'lláh, but that I cannot reject him because there could be nothing in the end which could justify my rejection. And that is in addition to and fully complementary with the fact that I'm in love with Baha'u'lláh, because he is the most beautiful thing that I have ever encountered.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. Again, I just enjoyed listening to you. Okay, this will be the last question, I think. So that discussion with Nay and Stephen was really around the question, and the question was, what is the nature of the language of revelation, from the angle of how are religious people going to use their revelation uh, in the modern system of knowledge? So how do you apply it to or how do you apply it? And if you do, how do you apply it? How do you use it? How do you reference it in any way in the context of the academic disciplines? And what is the role of philosophy there? And yeah, if you have anything to say on that, because I think from your angle I can deduce a little bit of where you might go, but there's no point for me to make assumptions if you're here.
This wraps into everything, and perhaps I should have started with this because I will make a plea to the Baha'i community on a number of from two angles.
Okay, yeah.
But in fact, I'm very curious. What do you think? How do you think I would answer, or what do you think? What would the kind of approach that I've taken for you entail?
I don't know enough in my like I haven't developed that to a point where it's really worthy of discussion, but I think that the language would be, you would confirm that view that there is a comprehensive philosophy in the Baha'i writings. And if one starts from that assumption, that opens a lot of doors already compared to other perspectives, right? So I would think that that's a position you would take. And then I think that you'd also maybe go into the direction of thinking you can map concepts, you can map philosophical and theological concepts, and then it all opens up. And I have no idea where you would take it, what you would think about philosophy that relates to the Baha'i writings, or what notion of theology you would have, and if you have one, who would do what. Yeah.
I think it's a question we have to come to both on its own terms and also exegetically, whether the Baha'i faith has a consistent philosophy embedded within it. So the question is, should we have a consistent metaphysical picture of the world? I would say yes, we need to. And I think that that some principles, like the principle of non-contradiction, are self-evident, and it has to do with our immediate intuition of being. Being is not being. And truth has to be consistent. There's just contradiction is just not truth. It just is not being. It's non-existence. It's nihility, and that we can have a basic metaphysical picture of reality. Remember, I showed you this. We can prove that any rejection of the principle of causality, if it's to be a rational objection, has to assume causality because our conclusions are caused by our apprehension of prior premises. There's just no way out of this. Reason is absolute. And I think a properly theistic conception of the world is that reason is absolute ontologically. God is reason itself. He is a pure intellect. He is pure mind, which is the origin of all things. So that's why theism is the most consistently rational worldview, because if our rationality were not an immaterial reality, then all of my beliefs would be determined by sub-rational physical processes in my brain. And then simply be illusory that I have a belief on the basis of good reasons, since reasons for things are immaterial. They're material facts in my brain. So if I have a rational faculty, which is somehow able to transcend the determinations of a blind and mechanistic world, then I have an immaterial faculty, which is a spiritual faculty. So the idea that God exists is the only one which a consistent rationality could come to, because rationality entails that everything has a sufficient explanation. And without God, there is something that has no explanation, which is the existence of nature. And God has an internal explanation insofar as he is existence itself. It is his very essence to be. And that's not hand waving. That's just saying that if something is what it is, then what its essence is the immediate explanation for what it is. Just like if you ask me why a triangle has three sides and is a plane figure, that just is what a triangle is. God is not a brute fact. It's merely that he is existence itself and therefore cannot fail to exist, and therefore suffices to explain himself and anything which comes after him. It's also the case that rationality would be inexplicable if rationality were not somehow at the root of the natural world. So in existence, we find that there are beings who have intellects and reason, and we find that there is a world which is apprehensible to us by reason because it has intelligible structures. And our various sciences are various ways of mapping out in a variety of domains the intelligible structure of the world. So then the question that comes before us is what can ultimately account for the fact that there are minds that can reason and that there is a reality before us which can be apprehended by our rational faculties insofar as it contains an intelligible structure. And I think that the only satisfying explanation for the existence of rational minds and the existence of a rational world, rational insofar as it can be apprehended by reason, is that the world is apprehensible by reason insofar as it has been first been conceived by reason, by an ultimate reason, by the Logos. It can be apprehended by the mind because it has been first conceived by the mind. For example, if we were to read a book, the reason that it has content that we can understand, that is, content which is of such in nature as to be understandable by a mind is that it was first conceived by the mind. It is a transcript of thoughts, and it can be communicated from one mind to another. But it couldn't be a transcript of thoughts if it weren't first conceived and created by mind. So the world is a reflection of the thoughts of an original and all-pervading intellect, and that is the primal will. And this primal will, insofar as it is not the ultimate cause, must itself be dependent upon an ultimate reality, which transcends our comprehension as finite minds. But that ultimate reality is not, in essence, irrational. It's not even, in essence, unapprehensible, since it's immediately apprehensible to itself as the ultimate reason. And the primal will is in the best position to have an apprehension of the ultimate and transcendental essence. But even there is a degree of limitation, insofar as the primal will is not identical to God. Therefore, its thought and idea of God is not simply identical to God's essence, whereas God's very idea of himself is simply his essence. There's no division or distinction here. So I think in order to follow up on some of your other questions, it's to what degree we should be confident that there is a philosophy embedded in the Baha'i faith, and in what way we can convey this philosophy and ought to convey this philosophy in a variety of discourses in contemporary society. Now, I would say first off that it would be my suggestion in terms of Baha'i scholarship to be confident that in fact there is a philosophy embedded in the faith, that Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha are consistent in what they take the ontological structure of reality to be. If what they convey to us is not the complete structure, that doesn't mean that it is not true, because there are degrees of truth. It's not that Isaac Newton had an ultimately false theory. It's that what was true was perhaps a part of reality, and he did cipher out some of the intelligible structure of the reality, and that is why the Newtonian equations are able to be fit in with general relativity, but general relativity gives us a more expansive picture. I would say in the realm of physics, it is likely that general relativity will, in time, give place to an even more comprehensive theory, which doesn't annul the apprehension by physicists now of certain of the intelligible and quantifiable aspects of reality, but which will contain it and articulate it within an even more expansive framework. So this is not relativism. It just says that there are degrees to our knowledge, but what we do know, we legitimately know. So I would say that part of what Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'lláh give us is that the conclusion that God exists is something which we are compelled to assent to by virtue of a rational investigation of reality, and therefore has a basis, and that God is the ultimate explanation for the rational order that pervades existence and for our very capacity to think rationally and abstractly about things, insofar as we cannot account for human faculties merely through a physicalist framework, and that therefore we could only account for human rational faculties through a transcendental cause, which already contains the perfections of intellect and will in a higher way. Another thing is that there is simply no tenable way to assert that Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'lláh give a mere social remedy, or simply give us a framework of values which is divorced or agnostic about the actual ontological structure of the world. So if you say that human beings ought to have certain values and virtues, if we ought to have a civilization that it enjoys ever-increasing orders of unity, the question is, what is the basis of this assumption? Why shouldn't I just have an altogether different set of values? And the best answer we can give is that any other set of values would be ultimately out of order with and incongruent with the structure of reality as it stands, and incompatible with human nature. And so soon as we say that there is a human nature that ought to actualize itself in certain ways, we are committed to certain ontological propositions. So I would say the idea of Kant, that the existence of God is not something that we can prove rationally, but which we have to have as a postulate of the practical reason. That is to say that we believe in God because without God, morality doesn't make sense. But really, we don't really know if our concept of God really maps onto anything in reality. This is simply not supported in the Baha'i writings. God is the ultimate explanation of value, but he is also the ultimate explanation of existence and of the rational order which we see pervading and encompassing all existence. It is for this reason that Abdu'l Baha in the tablet to Pharrell doesn't simply say that we believe in God because without God we can't be good people. He says that the existence of the deity, Hazrat-e-Uluhiyat, has been established on the strength of theoretical, logical, and rational principles. This is a decisive statement. So both exegetically and on independent philosophical grounds, I think that we can assert that reality has a certain metaphysical and ontological structure, that there are many more things to be known about the universe and the cosmos, but that the knowledge that we do have now is legitimate knowledge. So I think this is how we ought to interact with various communities of discourse. First, we have to do philosophy, and we need to engage with philosophy of religion. And there are great thinkers in the variety of traditions. The Muslims have the heritage of Islamic philosophy. The Christian world has great figures like David Bentley Hart and Edward Fraser and William Lane Craig who are giving a rational case for their religions. Yet we who are possessed of one of the most quintessentially philosophical religions, we who have a religion that has founders who did not just say, believe me, but believe me because of these reasons. Let us recall that Baha'u'lláh in the Kitab-i-Iqan does not say anything which he doesn't advance a rational argument for, and says that we must first cleanse our hearts of both love and hate, lest any one of those interfere with the rational investigation of the truth. Let us remember that we have a faith that from its very basis insists that it is to be rationally established. So I think this is how we ought to engage with these philosophies of discourse. And we can do so not by attacking views that are contrary to our own, but affirming the many commonalities that exist. We should be cooperating with these theistic philosophers and then show that what Baha'u'lláh offers is something which is an even greater integration of this perennial philosophy with a vision of the world, which is simply the one vision which could prove to be the ultimate salvation of the human race. Insofar as if we do not endeavor to found a world civilization on the basis of spiritual values, the very material existence of humanity will be radically undermined, because we will be so vitiated by nationalistic and creedal prejudices that we will be unable to secure the perpetual peace that we desire. So the question is that the question before us is that really without this robust notion of the ontological framework of existence, we cannot assert the values that we want to assert, that the human beings can only flourish given a recognition of God in the immortal soul, and that we can only acquire virtues if we exist in a virtuous world community. And this world community has to be so constituted as to enable us to acquire these moral perfections. So it's in this way that the question of truth and the question of the good are inextricably related. You cannot divorce the question of values from the question of what is true and what the ontological structure of reality is. And it is the Baha'i position, so far as I can tell, that what we recognize as true, we also recognize as good, and that the very idea of truth has a normative dimension to it. We ought to know the true. It is good to know the true, and that this is also a part of human nature. And the true and the good, in turn, relate to what is beautiful, which is the aesthetic appreciation of, say, what is truly good and what is truly good. So God is the most beautiful, and he is infinite beauty itself, and he appears to us as beautiful insofar as he appears to us in Baha, in splendorous beauty, radiant beauty, since that is in fact the principal meaning of Baha. So I think that Baha'u'llah's vision is that we have a civilization that recognizes what is the actual structure of reality, that it comes from one absolute deity through the mediation of the primal will, and that this civilization is so constituted as to enable us to flourish as human beings, as spiritual and rational beings. And that this is precisely what the Baha'i faith is for, and that this civilization would be the one that most reflects and inculcates the principle of beauty as well. So having said that, I think we can also succinctly say, what is the philosophical case for the Baha'i faith? And And I think that this is the philosophical case, which has the potential of persuading those who are open to it, since I think there's much openness now. And the academic philosophy, the academic study of religion and the philosophy of religion is flourishing. And more people are coming to the conclusion that the existence of God is rational, and in fact, the only possible answer to the rational inquiry into the nature of existence.
Thank you. I just hope everyone can appreciate how well you have formulated and presented your arguments and your line of thinking. Considering there were no questions even set in advance, I made them up as we went. So we have not met before properly. We never had a conversation like this, so it was really amazing.
Well, I have one final point.
Yeah,
That's actually
go ahead.
Here's the structure. Here's the structure of it, and perhaps everybody, the conversation's been so long that everybody has had too much at this point. But I'll say this, and I think that this is the philosophical proof for the Baha'i faith. Because there are scriptural proofs, there are experiential proofs. Many people become Baha'i simply because they're so attracted by the principles of Baha'u'lláh and his vision for the world. And so they recognize it on the levels of the good and the beautiful, but what about on the level of the true? And it's this, that on independent grounds, we come to the conclusion that God exists as the best explanation for the existence of a contingent world and its rational and intelligible order. We also come to the conclusion on a philosophical basis that a human being is not purely physical. It's not just an animal, that our higher faculties of abstract thought and rationality point to the existence of an immaterial, immortal soul, and that therefore has a soul which therefore has a destiny beyond this life. And that human flourishing and happiness is something that involves the recognition of this deity and the inculcation of a moral life which prepares us for our destiny, and that we ought to establish a civilization of ever increasing orders of unity, which best enables human flourishing on the individual and collective scale. So the question then is, how do we achieve that end? So I would say this, that we need a divine educator, because by our own unaided efforts, we're liable to come to error with respect to our understanding of the nature of God, and we are liable to come into error with respect to our moral lives and with respect to the type of civilization that we ought to establish. Now, it is one of Avicenna's, I think, very insightful points, that the existence of a divine legislator, a divine educator in this world is a requisite of divine providence. Since he says, if you look at the order of the world, you see that God has accounted for even things which are helpful but not necessary, such as the existence of our fingernails and our eyebrows, which we could do without, but which he has nonetheless provided. Therefore, it would be contrary to the providence of the divinity to deprive us of that which we need most of all, which is a divine legislator, a divine educator, which he says is so exalted that he is well nigh a human god. Nekadu en yakuna reppen insomnia. He is well nigh a human god. So then we can just rationally lay out what would the criteria be for this divine educator and in what way he would be distinguished from us. And I think that we've outlined many of these ways already in this conversation. First off, he must have preternatural knowledge. He has to have an innate understanding of the structure of reality and the existence of God, such that he can relay it to us. So he has to have preternatural knowledge. He has to have moral perfection, since he must already possess what he is meant to inculcate in us. He can't have any moral conflict within himself. He has to be possessed of an innate charisma and beauty, which would be able to be apprehended by those who are in his immediate presence. So these would be the proofs of his person. He also would have a word or teachings which are in accordance with what we have already laid out. So he would give us information and true doctrine with respect to the existence of the transcendent deity, and he would also have teachings which are morally transformative, which actually enable us to be good and which are possessed of a unique beauty. So this would be the proofs of his word. And then I think there would be the proofs of his community, that in order for these teachings to be effective in the world, they would have to endure, and they would endure through laws and institutions. And then they would endure through a community of practice. He would be able to raise up a community in which he would have an ongoing spiritual presence. And these are just the minimum. These are the minimum criteria. And it seems to me that when we look in the history of the world, there are very, very few people who fulfill all criteria for being a divine educator. For example, we might have moral saints, but who have average intellectual abilities, or even stupendous intellectual abilities, but which do not seem to transcend normal human capacity. Or we might have people such as Einstein or Newton, who had a piercing apprehension of the intelligible structure of reality, but who did not pair that with, say, moral perfection, or who were not able to pair that with a comprehensive understanding of the divine structure of reality, its origin in God, etc. Or we might have people who do seem to be moral saints and who do seem to have a penetrating understanding of reality, perhaps Socrates, but who have a word that is not necessarily morally transformative, right? Who affects only some, but is not able to reform the commonality of man. Or we might have people who have all three of those, but did not, in fact, lay down institutions and laws and a community around themselves, which would form the basis of a new civilization, and people who do not have, say, an ongoing spiritual presence in individuals and in that community. So when you look at the people who could possibly fulfill all criteria for being a divine educator, we find only the founders of the world religions, such as Moses or Zoroaster or Christ or Muhammad or the Buddha or Krishna. The problem is these figures are removed enough from us in time that we cannot with absolute certainty determine whether they fulfill all criteria. Christ seems to fulfill many of these, for example, preternatural knowledge and wisdom, so long as we assent to the historicity of the Gospels and certain aspects of them. For example, his preternatural knowledge is revealed in his prophecy of the destruction of the temple. But it could be debated whether or not that prophecy came after was added as an interpolation by Christians after the destruction of the temple. So the unique thing about Baha'u'lláh is that he comes close enough in time that we can evaluate with absolute certainty whether he did or did not fulfill these criteria. And I find that he fulfills these criteria so remarkably that I cannot withhold my assent from Baha'u'lláh. So all Baha'is are familiar with Baha'u'llah's life, the courage with which he accepted the cause of the bomb, the way to which he dedicated himself to the ultimate aim of the reconciliation of all the kindreds and peoples of the earth, with absolute courage, and that there is no point at which his moral integrity could be questioned. Baha'u'lláh is possessed of preternatural knowledge. He affirms in his teachings the conclusions that we have come to on an independent and rational basis, the existence of a transcendent God, of an immaterial soul, and that Baha'u'lláh portrays these teachings in a way that transcends the mythological, right, and mythological stories in past religions. And in fact, the teachings of past religions, he preserves them, but extricates them from their irrational or more mythological structures. So, for example, the idea that God is a man who created Adam and Eve in a garden, and that there's a physical resurrection and the like, Baha'u'lláh says these have symbolic and spiritual meanings. So he is able to affirm the rational elements to the exclusion of the irrational elements. We also find that Baha'u'lláh is a morally transformative word, that Baha'u'lláh was possessed of a personal charisma and produced writings which are some of the most beautiful as could possibly be conceived. I have studied Persian literature over a period of 1,000 years, from Ferdowsi to Hatip Esfahani, and I have been extremely impressed by the beauties found therein, which are at least equal to, if not surpassing, that of other literatures of the world. Yet I find the writings of Baha'u'lláh to possess a distinct quality, which is their surpassing beauty, and that this is uniquely characteristic of Scripture. It is the same kind of beauty that we find in the Gospels, in the Gathas of Zoroaster, in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Buddhist sutras, and I think paradigmatically now for our age in the writings of Baha'u'lláh. We also find that he established institutions and laws which are appropriate to this age, that he raised up a new race of man, which is the Baha'i community, and that he has an ongoing spiritual presence in that community and in the lives of those who accept him. So Baha'u'lláh fulfills all criteria and all proofs. In addition to those Dala'il Naqli, those traditional or biblical and scriptural prophecies which he fulfills. And it would probably be another section to prove the preternatural knowledge of Baha'u'lláh, but this is established not only by the philosophical sophistication of his teachings, but also by the fact that Baha'u'lláh has over 10 prophecies which have been fulfilled. He foretold the coming of an ensuing conflict with Germany, World War I. He foretold the fall of the Caliphate and the Ottoman Empire. He foretold the destruction of his house in Baghdad. He foretold the discovery of nuclear power and the transmutation of the elements. He foretold the defeat of Napoleon in the Battle of Sedan. He foretold this and this and this and this. At no point does he ever come to a mistake. Baha'u'llah's capacities for knowledge and for moral integrity and for spiritual transformation are simply unmatched and unsurpassed by anybody in the recent history of mankind. It seems then to me that the test of C.S. Lewis with respect to Christ can be applied to Baha'u'lláh. He says, you know, when Christ says that I am God or I am a manifestation of the divinity, we can say that he is Lord or that he is a liar, that he is a lunatic, God forbid. So Baha'u'lláh, we have to ask, makes a great claim, and how are we to take it? Either his claim is false, and he knowingly perpetuated a fraud, but this does not seem consistent with his character. Or he's simply not in his right mind, because to say that one is God when one is not is a symptom of madness. Yet this doesn't seem quite right, because Baha'u'lláh seems, of all people, the most sane. When everybody was insane with nationalist fervor and creedal prejudice, Baha'u'lláh gives us a sane prescription for the unity of the world. So then I think that we have to come we have to very seriously consider that Baha'u'lláh knew exactly what he was saying, that he meant what he said, and that he was right to say it. And that it's not so much that we have many reasons to accept Baha'u'lláh, but we really have no excuse in not accepting him. And that's how I feel, especially when I look at my own life and see that everything good in me has proceeded from Baha'u'lláh. Everything bad is from my own self. So when he asks us then to make a choice, the choice of commitment, I think the one sane response is to say, yes, Baha'u'lláh, we love you and we commit to you and we will become wedded to you. And perhaps that seems like it's an act of faith, and perhaps it is. But ultimately, the act of faith is not distinct from the act of reason, which is finally to submit ourselves to what is most lovable.
Thank you. And that was incredible for considering the time and the challenges. It was really very impressive. And I hope the first of many interviews you're going to have with people who are a lot more qualified than me to ask you questions. Nevertheless, like really, you have all my appreciation. And really thank you for showing up without really, without really knowing me or what I do and all of that.
For the platform.
So thank you so much. And hopefully there'll be more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, and for the work that you've been doing. It's very important.